Well, hi, it's Thursday at 1 o'clock, and again, we're here for our Facebook Live program, which we're doing every Thursday, of topics of various interest to Birmingham. Today's topic is education, and we have a lot to say and a lot we'd like to cover. So I'm here, I'm Leslie Pilak, and
I'm Caitlin Donnelly.
And so today we hope to spend about the next half hour telling tales of people, buildings, and getting it all in somehow. Here at our site, we have some of the most interesting buildings to talk about, but actually when it comes to schools, we need to make sure we touch on people. That's probably the most important place to start. So I believe that's where you come in.
Right, and so we know that schooling for a lot of families out there has been disrupted during this time, and normally during this time, during the month of May, early part of June, we would be swamped with school tours. We get every second grade class in the Birmingham School District, which encompasses much more than Birmingham. We can touch on that a little bit later. Coming through the museum. So normally we would not have time to do a Facebook Live. We would have 4 classes coming through today at least, and things would get a little wild. But since the second graders could not come to us this year, we decided to come to them. So we do have a playlist both on our Facebook video page and on our YouTube channel of a tour of the museum's Hunter House. We have about 6 videos. One's an overview, and then we have a short video for each room, so they're easily digestible. If you are looking for educational content, it is there. Please make use of it as you would.
And the most important student represented there is Bella, the Birmingham Police Department's therapy dog. She appears in every video to just help us understand what's important to be learning about. Okay, anything else you wanted to add about that right now?
No, I think that's everything.
Okay.
Everything on the video front.
On the video front. So the story about education in Birmingham really is a long one, and it begins when the settlers first came here. They were mostly from Pennsylvania and parts east, New York, and the value on education was very high. So almost as soon as they built their log cabins, they were looking for ways to educate the children. And so we had our first settlers coming in and gathering in 1818, 19, and 1820. By 1820, that's only 2 years in, settler Ziba Swan had a school operating on his property, and so did John Hamilton. In fact, John Hamilton, one of the founders with his family here at Birmingham, he actually had a building on his property that was, it was possible for the settlers to go in together and hire, and I think I use that term kind of loosely, but bring in a young man who would act as school teacher for the settlers' children. And that man happened to be Hervey Park, who was an early surveyor later. So he was actually doing a quick stint as a school teacher here in Settlement, Birmingham, before it was called Birmingham, while he was waiting to hear on his survey contract. So we've got evidence just right after that, the first period there, that people were already putting a value on education and trying to bring that to their children, even though they were also dealing with wolves, native people, and every other kind of wilderness issue. Okay, so fast forward, that was the 1820s, so by the 1850s, the settlement of Birmingham had its name, and there was a village here that was operating as a village unincorporated. But once again, the people came together and said, we need a place for our children to be educated. So they pooled their resources and they constructed the first schoolhouse in Birmingham and also the first brick schoolhouse, as far as we know, for many miles around. That brick schoolhouse was called the Red Schoolhouse because it was made of red local brick, and it became the foundation for the red brick at the Allen House that we have now, because The schoolhouse passed through ownership after it was no longer used as a schoolhouse, was briefly owned by Warren Clisby, who was Marion Clisby Allen's father. And then she, Marion Clisby Allen, and Harry Allen, who was the first mayor of Birmingham, inherited the property in 1926. So in that 50-year period, although it was a residence, its continuation and the heritage actually still kind of bumped up next to some of the other school history here. Before I turn it over to Caitlin, that school history, by the way, included Warren D. Clisby, Marion's father, who was a very controversial person, but he also came to Birmingham in the first place to be the superintendent of the school system here, which consisted of one school at the time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin, who's going to not talk about a building, but people.
Right, so one of the teachers of the Little Red Schoolhouse was a name we are all familiar with by now, Martha Baldwin. So as every story that you tell about Birmingham, Martha is involved, so let's just get her involvement out of the way. So she did teach at the Little Red Schoolhouse for about a year. And one of her students was actually a man whose birthday is today, George Mitchell, who was co-founder of Birmingham's first bank, Birmingham Eccentric newspaper, amongst many, many, many other things. And he tells this story of he had to write a paper on the native peoples that used to live in the area, prior to the European settlers coming in. And this was one of Martha's subjects of personal interest to her. And so she got really, really excited, like a lot of people who love history do, kind of wrote the paper for him, accidentally, of course. And everyone else was like, oh wow, George Mitchell, your paper is so good, you should read it in front of the entire school. And the day came, and Mitchell was so ashamed that he had not done any of his own original work, that he actually snuck out of class, snuck out of the assembly, and laid low for the rest of the day. So that he didn't have to read this paper. And of course, Martha Baldwin was involved with a lot in Birmingham, but she was actually an educator for over 30 years of her life. Mostly actually in the Detroit Public School System. Around 1870, there was a law passed that required students to actually be in school for a set length of time up to a certain age, which led to a lot of these children from maybe more working class or poorer families actually being required to be in school instead of maybe out in the fields or in a shop or anything like that. So school districts exploded, and Detroit was one of those. They just needed teachers. So she went down there, and actually within a couple of years, she became an assistant principal and then a principal. She was pretty controversial because she was trying to introduce new pedagogy methods and everything. Just constantly trying to do things better, like Martha did. And then when she came back, she was very involved in the education of other kids in the community. She was teaching kids in this community, but also one of the stories I touched in our latest unboxing video is the story of Charles Shane, who, his mom and Martha Baldwin were best friends, and Charles wanted to go to school and become a pharmacist. He was worried about the money. He didn't know how he'd pay his own way. And so Martha didn't have kids of her own. She had independent needs, and she's like, I got you. Like, she sent him to what is now Ferris State. He got his degree. When he came back, she helped him purchase the location for Shane's Pharmacy. And then this is one of those great little stories of, like, you set something in motion and it continues for long after you're gone. We just had Ethel Bassett Day, and she was the first registered female pharmacist in Oakland County. And she walks into Shane's Pharmacy in 1912 looking for a summer job. And she kind of finds her vocation there. She decides that she too wants to become a pharmacist. And this is, after Martha Baldwin's death. She goes to school for pharmacy. She becomes the first registered female pharmacist in Oakland County. machines for many years behind the desk, helping, her fellow residents in Birmingham get what they need. So, Martha Baldwin, and then after her death, because I feel like when she died in 1913, maybe some of her opponents or people who were tired of having a woman boss them around breathed a sigh of relief. They're like, okay, well, we don't have that woman constantly at us anymore. No, that's not how Martha rolled. In her will, she set down very clear specifications that Birmingham was going to have a new school. And it was going to be called the Baldwin School. And she had very specific specifications as to how it was going to be built and who it was going to serve. So she said, you need to have an auditorium that can seat, I forget how many people, but it was equivalent to like half the village at the time. She wanted it to be a space where the community could come and gather. And another thing that she specified was that it needed to have washing facilities for both men and women. Because she had seen firsthand in other schools how the facilities were unequal. The boys could have gym classes and sports classes because they had a washroom, but the girls couldn't because there wasn't a washroom. So, girls weren't getting the same education that boys were. And she's like, no, we're not playing that game here in Birmingham. This is how we're doing it. Everything is going to be equal. The Baldwin School went on for how many years, and how many students passed through its halls. So that was another one of her legacies.
And it's really interesting about how people have been inspired by teachers and the stories that follow them and how they've taken that inspiration. And I think we often talk about that in general. Teachers that stand out in our own education and some things they said or what they stood for and how that affected us and shaped us. And to go back a little bit, when Martha was coming up, the opportunities for public education for older children beyond elementary age were all private. That's the only way you could continue your education. There was no compulsory education for older kids. But a very visionary minister, Reverend Samuel Hill in Birmingham, opened an academy, and he taught students from Birmingham for tuition in areas like the more advanced, mathematics, English, foreign languages, Greek, and Latin probably to some degree. And Martha was one of his students. And that academy drew students from all around Oakland County and had a very good reputation until, unfortunately, in 1867, it was operating from like the 1850s. So in 1867, it burned. It was in a building that was owned by Roswell Merrill, who was another important name in early Birmingham. And the building was at Maple and Pierce. It was a wooden frame building, and they used the upstairs for the academy, and it burned. And so they lost their ability to congregate. And that's one of the things about education, by the way, is that, as parents know right now, you could do a fair amount of education in your home, but there's nothing like having children or students of any age gathered in one environment, which is all about teaching and all about supporting education and educational experiences. It's completely different. So when they lost their building, there was nowhere else for students to gather in numbers. And again, the village came together and said, we need to build a building that will house not just our older students, but our younger students too. And that was the impetus for building the Hill School. The Hill School was a very large, sort of picture a one-room school, only 3 stories high and sort of burgeoning at the seams. And you have the concept. All the classes went there, although they were separated by, I believe, not just classrooms, but also by the stories inside the Hill School. And it was named first the Union School, but then it took on the name of the Hill School in honor of Reverend Sam Hill. And the Hill School was, again, a unique building. It was very large, and it gathered all the students together. And Hill School was for all grades until about 1912, when there were just too many young people and they needed to build other schools. So one of the things about education anywhere, but certainly in Birmingham, is the story changes depending on where people were gathering and when buildings were being built, which depends an awful lot on finances and funding and the community will to create new buildings. So there's more to say about that. I'm going to talk about Clarence Blees, but I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to throw in before I get there.
Not really. Well, I mean, Martha Baldwin did lead the charge for naming Hill School after Sam Hill. So another way that she was just super involved.
Yeah, we don't know if Martha became an educator because of her experience with Sam Hill, or if it just, kind of came together as the right thing for her to do. But following Martha's leadership in education in Birmingham, a new superintendent came in. And the superintendent role was present before this, certainly, but Clarence Blees, that is V-L-I-E-T, came to Birmingham and was the superintendent of schools for something like, I think, 16 or 17 years. But he came here at a time when this explosion of population and interest in fine schools and new ideas about education was all happening. So during his time, he championed the issue of several bonds to raise funds to build schools so that Birmingham would have a first-class education system in place. And I think if you're a Birmingham parent these days, you'd have to say that hasn't changed. If anything, it's continued to build. The reputation of the Birmingham schools has just grown. And I think people want to move to Birmingham because of the schools, just as much as they did in the 1920s. So with that, I will invite you to add some background maybe about Seaholm and its development.
Right. So, I mean, as the district was growing, the district was expanding, more and more students were arriving, people were moving to the community for the schools, then as now. There became a need for a new Birmingham High. So, Birmingham High is a name given to at least 3 or 4 schools that have existed in the district, and so people will bring in things all the time, and they're like, oh, I have such and such from Birmingham High, where was that? And I always have to insult a timeline that one of my former colleagues created, because at certain times Hill School was Birmingham High, at other times it was Baldwin, and then they built the new Birmingham High in the 1950s, and this was a time where a lot of people were getting involved with the governance of the schools and how they were being run. And one of those was a man named Ernest Seaholm, who had retired from the Cadillac Motor Company and picked up a new career because he's like, look, I'm always working. I gotta find something else to do. So he started working with the Birmingham Public Schools. And he was always going and he was always kind of tinkering with things. He was a born engineer, so he's always trying to make things slightly better. Like, how are we going to set up classrooms to make sure that they're super efficient? I want to look into the details of the backgrounds of all the teachers that we're looking to hire. And so a couple years after the new Birmingham High was built, it was renamed Seaholm in his honor. And then, of course, Seaholm got crowded. So they needed to build a new high school, so they then built Groves in the 1960s after one of the treasurers of the department, which probably helped make all the building possible. You need someone that's good with money to make all these new building projects possible. So so Seaholm High was also Birmingham High for a little bit. And I know sometimes people who graduate from Groves are a little bit salty because people who went to Seaholm still would call it Birmingham High. They're like, well, then what are we? And we are going to have, well, maybe you can talk about a project that we're launching this summer.
Sure. One more comment to make about Grove's school is that I think it was 7 years between when Seaholm was built, I think 1952, and when Grove's was built, which was 1959, there was a new architectural trend that was showing up in a lot of public buildings called mid-century modern. You may have heard of it. And actually Grove's has some really, really cool mid-century modern features, such as a wavy roof along one of the main facade areas. So if you haven't physically looked at the building or don't know about it, check it out. But regarding that Seaholm and Grove's pairing, let's call it, they both came to be within just a few years of each other. They both have fantastic reputations. They're both part of the same school system. So you know what that means, rivalry. And where do you see rivalry? Sports and competitions. You see it in all of the, everything from sports to debate to, all of those sorts of things, but especially sports. So we just happen to have a special relationship with a graduate from Seaholm, Tyler Firestone. He graduated last year, and he came here to do a special cornerstone project, and he did a research project about the growth of Birmingham. And you know how it is when you're inspired and history speaks to you, you go on to specialize in it. So he went away to school, and he's studying history, but he contacted us to say, I want to do a virtual internship. And he is now going to be providing us with episodic programs, or I guess I should say articles, for over the summer about the rivalry between Seaholm and Grove's. Being a Seaholm grad, he might have bias, but we're going to be watching for that. And so he's going to be talking about different themes each time, and we'll be posting those probably on our Facebook page is what I would imagine. And so you get a chance to know a little bit more about Tyler, and you may weigh in on your own feelings about Grove's versus Seaholm. I'm sure you have them if you went to school here.
Yeah, I guess since we do have a little bit of time, one of the questions that we always would get from chaperones and sometimes educators that would come through on school tours is like, why does Birmingham School District go outside Birmingham's borders? So it extends into a little bit of Southfield, a little bit of Bloomfield, Bingham Farms, Lathrop Village. So it's just kind of like this weirdly shaped octopus, like the weirdest shaped octopus. And so people want to know about that, so why, because you look at other districts and you're kind of very neatly contained within the city's borders. And part of that goes back to the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, when the district was just a powerhouse. It had all these buildings, it had, every grade that you needed, and so a lot of these younger communities that were springing up around Oakland County, maybe they did have a one-room schoolhouse, but they either didn't have the funding to build their own high school, or maybe they just didn't have the students. If you have a one-room schoolhouse with 6 total students, you're probably not going to build a brand new high school just for, a graduating class of 1. So they would send their students to Birmingham schools, and they would pay tuition. That would just cover that child's education for the year, which was a system that chugged along merrily in the late 1800s, but coming into the 1920s, the Birmingham School District realized that while the tuition was great, they didn't have money going into the cost of maintaining their buildings. They didn't have money coming in to, do repairs and all that. So they went to all these other little communities, and you're like, listen, tuition's great, but we need a little bit more. So here's the thing. You can either join our school district and give us your tax revenue, or you can build your own school district. choose one. So some communities did decide to branch off and create their own school districts, but others chose to stay. And that is a situation that is still today, and that's kind of why that our district is kind of funny looking. If you look at a map of it, I have a 2008 school district map that I can post in the comments once we're done here. And yeah, it's weird looking when you look at it. But, you know, and so it is kind of weird to think about a lot of times in these communities, your school district is older than the town you're in. And that's certainly true for Birmingham, and it's true for, I think, most communities in Michigan. And so, yeah, sometimes you will see these communities where the school district kind of has weird boundaries, and that's why.
Well, thanks, because I know that idea of why is the district completely different than the town, it is like happens elsewhere too. But that's all about that evolution of because schooling wasn't compulsory and then it became compulsory, and how those districts were set up originally, and they had one-room schoolhouses, and there's a whole story there too. So in some school districts, depending on how broad they are, they might have children, like I know we do, have second graders who are actually live in Bingham Farms. And so their experience of their neighborhood is not like downtown Birmingham. It's a completely different experience, and yet we're talking to them about local history. So sometimes that's a thing to remember about schools, is that they bring together people from different backgrounds. There's a story that goes with this that, if we have time, okay, we have a quick minute. The Levinson family, who was the first Jewish family in Birmingham, moved here in the 1890s, and they raised 4 children here. 2 of their children went to Birmingham's public schools, and one of their sons, David Levinson, met his long life sweetheart in school, and she was not Jewish, she was not of the faith. Her name was Martha Nye, and they later married and created a whole interesting branch of the Levinson family that's Catholic. So I think that's just kind of talks a little bit about that. And there's one other interesting backstory, and it's really not about public education, you know, K-12, so much as it is about what happens after the standard education. And in the 1890s, well, 1880s, but 1890s especially, in 1900s and 10s, it appears as though there was sort of a pipeline between Birmingham's young women of talent, some of the powerhouse women that, such as Martha Baldwin and the Ladies Library Association and Ruth Shane, who had means and vision and education themselves, to help some of these very intelligent and bright girls get out of town and go to U of M. And it seems that there was some financial support to make that happen. So there's a kind of a disproportionate number of young women from Birmingham during that period in U of M's graduate roles. And so although we haven't investigated it further, it's very intriguing. So I wanted to mention that. And last but not least, when it comes to Birmingham inspiring teachers, history, the museum, there's one woman who stands out, and she probably has led more children through the path of history in Birmingham than anyone, and that is Pat Andrews. So Pat Andrews.
Yeah, so I worked with Pat Andrews for about 4 years now. I guess now is a good time to mention, if you've ever wondered why the Birmingham Museum chose to hire me, it's because they needed an education person. And that's how I got here. So, but yeah, and she's just a wealth of knowledge. She has her own museum dedicated to Birmingham history that she operates out of her garage. And then she comes in each year. She is 97, 98. And she still comes in and helps us give school tours every year. So she dresses up in period clothing. She sits with the students. Nowadays, she usually just comes on the date that Corton Elementary would come in, because she is a lifelong teacher in the Birmingham district, an elementary grade teacher, and she worked at Corton the longest. So she has the most connection to that. So chances are, if you or a family member attended Wharton Elementary or has come here for a second grade school tour, you have encountered Pat Andrews, and she is wonderful.
Right, and Pat and some of her fellow teachers and retired teachers actually created the historical tour, the historical presentation for second grade. Well, actually, I think they started with slightly older students, which now it's the second grade curriculum. So she founded that whole idea of the Hunter House tours that we keep telling and retelling. You know, we update it as we need to, but we owe her and all of our teachers, past and present. And in fact, Bill Pugh, the curriculum coordinator, is another person who helps facilitate the tours and the contact between students today in our museum. So thanks to all of our teachers, past and present and future. And thanks for visiting today.
Yes, and next week we're gonna switch it up a little bit. We're having a tree planting out in the John West Hunter Park behind the museum, and we will be live streaming that. It's a fun little Arbor Day sort of thing. So, and then the week after that, we'll come back with another discussion. So, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next week. Have a good one.
Bye.